Welcome everybody. We are still letting a few people in. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Everybody walk right in, take your seat. Okay. So welcome everybody. We are just about to start. I'm going to give everyone maybe just another minute to find their way here. And then we'll be starting with a Shalom Chant. So I invite you to close your eyes and just find your breath. We enter into this moment with shalom, with energies of wholeness, energies of peace and harmony, just as we will exit this time together the same way. Peace, harmony, and wholeness are some of the translations of the word shalom. So I invite you, if you so choose, to chant with us, to draw a breath now for Shalom. יהיו לרצון עם רפי והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני. Holy One of Being, Holy One who manifests through and as each and every one of us. Help us to know your presence in this space, in this moment. that the words of our mouths, the meditations of our heart might flow from the fullness of your being, Holy One. Adonai Tzuri Vegoali. Holy One, you are source. And you are Redeemer. Amen. So welcome back, everybody, from our little break last week. We have a lot to cover tonight, as I believe we will have every night. But the way I want to start tonight actually is with a visual, with a map, because that's going to be very important for us to situate where the story is unfolding. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to share with you this map. There. This is the map of really the Jewish world and also the Christian world at this point in the first centuries of the Common Era. This is taking place under the auspices of the Roman Empire. And what you see in kind of a brownish color around Turkey, it's a little more pale brown, more beige, and then a darker brown beyond that. These are the expansion of Christianity through those first couple of centuries. You can see little yellow dots throughout the map as well. Some within the brown colors and some also without. Some outside of that. Very few, but some. And those little yellow dots are where the Jews, the Jewish communities that, were created through those centuries, and where Jews settled. I'll talk about this more in depth in just a moment, but just to give you kind of an idea where the Jews went. And there are some squares surrounding some of those yellow dots. These were also not just where Jews settled, but out of where the Jews settled, also where leading Christians community came to be. So you see there is a dominant Christian community in Rome, in Alexandria, in Egypt, in Jerusalem, of course, and in Antioch. Those were kind of the four major centers of Christianity through this earlier century. What I want you to pay attention to specifically is how far Jews already went. There are even Jews in the first few centuries of the Common Era, if you look, in London, on the in the northernmost community. It's not called London yet, but it's a good way to to know where we are. When I say London, most people know where to find it. There are Jews already in Paris, and in Lyon, in several parts of France, as you can tell. There are Jews in Spain already, following the Roman Empire, already in Cordoba and Toledo, and we'll see how big those communities will become 1,000 years from now. If you go down from Spain, there are two little dots in the tip of Africa there. That's Morocco. Then where it says Mauritania, above that's Algiers. That would be Algiers today. To the right, several Jewish communities there. That would be Tunisia today. And then where it says Tripolis and Libya, that's actually where it says Apollonia. That's all Libya actually today. And then obviously Egypt and the Middle East in many places. Going around the Mediterranean Sea, many Jewish communities in Turkey, what's today Greece, Romania, and obviously a lot of Jewish communities in Italy. So you can see there's Jews who went through really the entire Roman Empire. What we don't see on this map is further to the right, the major communities in Babylon, in today's Iraq, that are beyond this map. Huge Jewish communities there, but that's beyond the Roman Empire. So keep this in mind as we go back to our narrative, because I'm going to refer back to this map at different times. So hopefully this is burned into your mind as we begin. And we begin after the Romans brutally crush the last Jewish revolts in the 100+ years of war against the Jews. The last Jewish revolt is crushed extremely violently by the year 136 CE of the Common Era. And by that point, the Jewish population is completely decimated. The scholarly estimation is that by the end of the revolt, which took several years, around 580,000 Jews were massacred by the Romans. We account for about 1,000 villages that are completely destroyed as well. And though many Jewish families still manage, as we saw on the map, to remain in the land, and we know for sure that their descendants, right, 2,000 years later, their descendants today represent the majority of the population of the state of Israel, which will be a very important item to remember later on. Again, the descendant of those families who stayed in Israel, scholars and whomever studies populations in different countries know and trace that the descendants of these families who stayed in Israel are now represent through their genetic transmission the majority of the population of the state of Israel. The rest of the Judean population is sold into slavery and sent to populate the farthest regions of the Roman Empire, all the way to London, right? And if you just picture the map again, those Jewish communities that spring up all around the Roman Empire, is not that Jews just decided to pack their bags and see wherever they could, resettle. They are sold into slavery and military, sent to those farthest reaches of the Roman Empire, wherever was convenient or needed for the Romans. Like, I don't want us to have this idea that, the Jews, of their own free will, packed their stuff and decided enough was enough. They were going to leave the promised land. Not at all. That is not how it happened. They were coerced into leaving the country, and in overwhelmingly, in most cases, were sold into slavery. So again, the story of a native population, right, that is exiled from its land through the process of slavery. And at the same time, as we also saw through the map, those few critical 100 years are the time where Christianity is also growing throughout the empire. The 4th century becomes a turning point in the relationship between Jews and Christians. In 312 CE, 312 of the Common Era, in the year 312, a battle is raging for the control of the Roman Empire between the Roman generals themselves. General Constantine, as the story goes, on the eve of a great battle for the control of Rome, General Constantine has a vision on the battlefield. He sees a cross in the sky, and above the cross, the words, and I quote, "In this sign, conquer," end quote. Now, understand, Constantine at that moment is a pagan, right? He's a Roman of pagan persuasion, you would say. And he looks at that vision, and what he derives from that vision is that it is a sign that the Christian God, the God of the Christians, would bring him to victory, and therefore to the absolute control over the Western Roman Empire. The next day, whether this vision happened or not, that's the myth, right? The next day, his troops enter Rome and win the battle. And they enter Rome with, as their official standard, soldiers carry the standards of the troops. The official standard became the cross. Now, scholars who study these things in depth, who don't really take visions as historical facts, believe that Constantine needed a political base within the city of Rome to be able to impose his authority. And so his arrival, this is conquering arrival under the standard of Christ, would have for sure given him the loyalty of this very well organized Christian minority in Rome, when no other general contender to the throne could ever gather a majority of any kind within the city. So this might have been, as far as scholars are concerned, a deeply calculating political statement that Constantine made in order to gain support and allies, staunch allies, inside the city of Rome as Constantine walked in as the winner of the battle. And these Christians, and as we saw on the map, Rome was one of the 4 major Christian community at the time. These Christians, in fact, Constantine's bet pays off. These Christians become the most powerful, staunch ally within that year where Constantine becomes the emperor of the Western Empire and begin to control it with great force. But he doesn't stop there. Why should he? From there, he takes also control over the Eastern Roman Empire. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to interrupt this again because I love map and I love visual. I'm someone who really learns from that. And so I want to share with you Constantine's empire as it is now unfolding. And that actually happens pretty quickly, right? If you remember, we talked about the conquest of Rome in 312. This map goes through 324. So by 306, so before even getting into Rome, he had already conquered all the western side of the empire. He had conquered Spain, France, what would be France today, and the southern British Isle, right? By winning the war and conquering Rome in 312, he adds Italy, and also, if you can see, all of the western side of North Africa. But he doesn't stop there. 316, so within 4 years, he expands his empire all the way through what used to be Yugoslavia. So today, today we would have, the northern part is what we would call the Austro-Hungarian Empire of several 1,000 years later, but all the way down to Greece. And then he's going to take him a little more time, but by 324, he overcomes the Eastern Roman Empire and basically comes to rule the entire and unify the entire Roman Empire under his rule. Okay? So that's how he does that. I think it's important for us to have a visual of the geography as well as the history of it, even if it's not directly right now connected to anti-Semitism. But you'll understand that it will ultimately. Later on, though he conquered all of it, he decides to split the empire back into two, again with the eastern side, who eventually becomes known as the Byzantine Empire, where that he sets up with Constantinople. I mean, if you're going to set a new capital, might as well do it under your name. He sets that Eastern Byzantine Empire with Constantinople as its capital. And actually, the Byzantine Empire will survive Rome, the Western Roman Empire, by 1,000 years. But back in 313, so we're just a year after he conquered Rome, Constantine does something that is going to have very important repercussion to the topic of anti-Semitism. He proclaims what is known as the Edict of Milan, giving freedom of religion not only to pagans, but also to the Christians and the Jews. Now you would think that's great, but there's always a twist in that, because though everybody was allowed to the freedom of religion, there were ones that were, let's say, more free than others, and those were the Christians who had supported him in his original conquests. And so over the years that followed the Edict of Milan, Constantine begins to order state-ordered building of churches all across the empire. And with that comes the early church formal organization. But while Christians, as we can imagine, were thriving under Constantine's rule, Jews begin to see more and more formal restrictions applied to their community, which goes against the freedom of religion of the edict itself. But that's what happens. They suddenly find themselves banned. For example, they're banned from intervening in case a Jew wants to convert to Christianity. Like, they can't try to persuade that Jew to not do that. They can't. It's illegal now for them to do that. And you understand why, the reasoning behind that. And conversely, Christians and pagans were now, let's say, discouraged to put it very mildly, from converting to Judaism. So there is these lines that are starting to be drawn between the communities. Now we hear Constantine describing Judaism as dangerous. That's a quote. Or as abominable. And though the edicts seem to be very tolerant at first, he himself becomes less and less so. And very quickly, following, in fact, his shift or his alliance with the Christian against the Jews, Jews become more and more disrespected in the empire, and more victims of abuse and right out disgust officially proclaimed. Now by 325 of the Common Era, as we saw from the map, Constantine has now absolute power, holding, which was new to Rome, I believe, holding together the political, the military, and the religious control over the empire. By 325, he gathers together 250 Christian bishops to a council. And that council takes place in Nicaea, which is in present-day Turkey. And in that council is adopted what becomes known as the Nicene Creed, whereby was proclaimed the belief in God, the belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and the belief in the Holy Spirit, the Trinity of Christianity. And with that taking center stage now as the religion of the empire, which is a radical change, and it's going to, obviously, we'll see, impact the life of the Jews moving forward. The early changes that were made was that Shabbat was moved to Sunday. That's what comes with that, with the Nicene Creed, is that Shabbat is moved to Sunday. Again, drawing lines, separating the communities. And Easter was also separated calendar-wise from Passover. And that's really critical, because what Christianity is seeing is that Passover is a challenge to Christianity. Why? Because Passover, compared to Easter, is really fun as a holiday. I mean, if you know the holiday of Easter, and if you've ever celebrated Passover, Passover is a great evening of storytelling, good food, and good company. And if you have Easter, which is not any of that, on the same day, and you're trying to attract those pagans, right, to come to be Christians, and you tell them, well, tonight, for our celebration, you could either go to Easter or go to Passover. Where do you want to go? The Christian leadership figured out that Passover would win most of the time, and so the splitting of the calendar was to alleviate the competition. You see right from the beginning that the wedge between Christianity and Judaism begins to grow, and it grows wider and wider and wider over time, with a church, in fact, growing more and more powerful within the empire. And so the status of the Jews begins to deteriorate, and it deteriorates very rapidly. Leaders of the church felt like they had to fight against Judaizing Christians also, because those Christians who looked at Judaism found great value in the Jewish customs, in the Jewish teachings, in the Jewish intellect. This is also the time where the Talmud is being written, and they feel that the Jewish customs were very attractive, and Judaism really was a very attractive religion. And one of the fiercest attackers of these Judaizing tendencies in Christians was John Chrysostom. I'm not sure. I think it's Chrysostom, but he became later on Saint John Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople. And he attacks virulently this openness of Christians to those Jewish practices, to the Jewish faith. And in fiery speeches against those Christians, he forbade any Christian to have any relationship with Jews. He calls them in his speeches. Again, they're not speeches for the Jews. They are speeches that he makes for the Christians, but in doing so, he attacks the Jews to kind of demonize them, so that to make them less attractive. And so he has a whole series of talks where he describes, and I quote, the Jews as the most miserable of men. He describes Jews as inveterate murderers, destroyers, men possessed of the devil, and whose synagogues were the house of the devil himself. Jews are described by his fiery speeches as thieves, as criminals, people who practice rites that are desecrating and impure. He, time and time again, tells his Christian audience how the Jews murdered Christ. And for that crime, for that sin, there was no expiation possible, no indulgence possible, no pardon to be given. God hated the Jews, he argued, which is why they were dispersed and rejected. And now we're talking about the Archbishop of Constantinople, which becomes one of the main Christian communities in the Roman world, and that's the leader of that community, whose influence goes far beyond just Constantinople, as you can imagine. That's the kind of rhetoric that begins to be spread around his area, around his see, if you want. And he was not alone, you can imagine. He wasn't alone preaching this kind of hatred. And though he wrote himself a kind of an interesting little parable, I guess you would call it. I don't know what else you would call it. He writes, when animals are unfit for work, and I'm quoting now, when animals are unfit for work, they are marked for slaughter. And so it is with the Jews. By making themselves unfit for work, the work of worshiping the correct God, right? They have become ready for slaughter. Christ said, and that he continues, I'm still quoting him here. Christ said, he names Christ as having said what follows. As for my enemies, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me. That's what he quotes Jesus to have said, which is unbelievable. But that's how the propaganda in fact begins. And it's no wonder that the synagogue at Antioch, we saw that Antioch was one of the Jewish communities, one of the big Jewish communities there, where actually Antioch was where he first preached. That synagogue was attacked obviously, and burned to the ground. And this is the first draft of the ritual murder charge brought against the Jews. Now I'm gonna stay with him because he's an important character and he's seminal into spreading those kind of ideas. He asks, as one of his fiery speeches, again, I mean, paradoxically, not aimed at the Jews. He asks, should the Jews be allowed to live as Jews? Right? And, the answer increasingly came back as a resounding no. And so in 414, too many ones here, in the year 414, we have the first large-scale pogrom which occurred, right, a savage assault on the large and ancient and in fact prestigious Jewish community of Alexandria. 414 is the first pogrom against the Jewish community, very ancient Jewish community of Alexandria. Remember, the Jews went to Alexandria back during the Greek Empire. So at that point, 414, that's about 700-800 years before. Following that, the church abolishes the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. So that's important. The Jews had their center still, up until that moment, their spiritual center, still in Jerusalem. It was called the Patriarchate, which was really held by at that point, the rabbis who are, in fact, writing the Talmud. Jerusalem was still the spiritual center of the Jewish people. But the church abolishes the Patriarchate in Jerusalem and reclaims the Holy Land for itself. And by doing that, Jews are now everywhere at risk. And what happened is that in Babylonia, the leader of the Jewish community there, which is beyond the reach of the Roman Empire, the leader of the Jewish community in Babylonia is named Exilarch, not the Patriarch anymore, but the Exilarch, right? Which basically is the Patriarch of the Jewish nation now in exile. Now I said that he was not the only one to speak those kind of violent words, and very quickly other monks and church leaders come to adopt the same kind of rhetoric. Saint Jerome, who actually translated the Jewish Bible, and he also translated not just the Jewish Bible but also the Gospels from the Greek to Latin, right? So a major figure in the church. He also shares the same kind of message. And of course, we have to mention Saint Augustine as another founding orator and theologian of the church and of the church's defamation of Judaism. Augustine himself actually wrote that God had dispersed the Jews but didn't destroy them. And he explains why. And that, what he's going to say now, is going to follow Christianity for a very long time. It's also another very seminal idea that is being planted here in the minds of the Christians that is going to stretch for hundreds and thousands of years. And listen to what his idea, what this very, very disturbing ideas and very eventually murderous idea is saying. God had dispersed the Jews but did not destroy them. Why? Because God had kept the Jews alive to bear witness to the triumph of the church, to be a permanent reminder that Christianity has replaced Judaism as the true faith, the true Israel. right? Can you feel the twisted aspect of that, right? The Jews were dispersed; they were not destroyed because they are bearing witness to supersession, right? I talked about supersession in the first two sessions. That the triumph of the church, not just that the Jews were to bear witness, they also should be kept humiliated. They should be kept humiliated. They should be kept defeated to show what happens to those who reject God's truth. So Jews were to be kept in poverty. Jews were to be kept as the bottom echelon of the ladder. They were to be continuously humiliated and defeated, not completely killed, not completely eradicated. Again, we needed a few of them to survive in order to bear witness to the triumph of the church, right? So he did not argue for the Jews to be murdered. He wanted them to suffer, though, for what they had done to Jesus, right? He wanted them to be kept around, to be continuously defeated, beaten up, and humiliated, so that they could be present to the end of days when Jesus would return and would prove once and for all their heresy and their error. And now, only because Jews were earmarked to serve this dark purpose, this I don't know how to call this, they serve this kind of punching ball purpose for Christians, right? So that they could step on the neck of the Jew to prop themselves up, only because they serve this purpose for the Christians, were they in fact allowed to live, be it always in poverty, always in tatters, always in complete degradation. And so this subjugation of the Jews was formalized with the passage of the Theodosian Code in 438. This was formalized through the Theodosian Code of 438. And in these views of the code, Jews were denied their humanity and their existence as a people in their own right. So, I've named but a few, but the language of these early Christian theologians will shape Christian attitudes and opinion in the too many generations that followed. And these were the seeds, in fact, of the ultimate genocide that took place 1500 years later. But for now, St. Augustine and his theological doctrine was prevailing and was becoming enshrined as the official church policy through Pope Gregory I, who died in 604. And his followers, who continued to hold that Jews were in theological error and therefore deserving of strict restrictions to keep them defeated, to keep them humiliated, but also needing to be kept around and neither be forcibly converted nor killed. Right? And though this led to the de-Judaizing of parts of Western Europe, who became Jew-free, and to in fact reshaping the legal and economic status of the Jews, those Jews were still allowed to live in other parts of Europe. And the truth of the matter is, in these other parts of Europe, Jews for centuries lived there mostly unharmed. Again, because those early theologies did not encourage the murder of the Jews. They were to be kept alive for the purpose that this serves, which was to bear witness to the triumph of the church. They were going to be kept alive in the most dire conditions, but they were still, kind of protected, in fact, which is kind of an interesting, if you look at it from that perspective, they in fact were protected by this new theology that comes to dominate the early few hundred years of Christian rule, I would say. By the way, I'm going to show you now another map, the map of the Roman Empire, circa 600 CE, and it's an important map to look at because when we get into the 7th century, this is the map basically by the year 600 of the Roman Empire, just a decade before, because that's happening in the first decade of the 7th century, a decade before the birth of Islam, right? So that's why I want to show you that map. So hang on. Let me do that right now. It's always a couple clicks. Here it is. The Roman Empire, as you can see on the bottom left corner, by the year 600, just before the birth of Islam. You can see that the Western Roman Empire has collapsed, and what's left of it really is just the southern part of Rome and the northern tip of Tunisia, and a few islands with Sicilia, Sardinia, and Corsica. Everything else was invaded by tribes that came from Central Europe and took over, and then all of those territories were split among the different rulers. So this is the map of what's left of the Roman Empire at that critical year of 600 of the Common Era. All right. And we'll come back to that, obviously, when we talk about Islam a couple months from today. So I am now, you're realizing that in this session, I'm going to be covering 1,000 years of history. It wasn't the case the first two sessions. I kind of remain within the first 100 years. This is the longest stretch of history that we'll get to cover in one session. So fasten your seatbelts. By the year 900, so we're already at the year 900, a growing number of Jewish families have come to settle in the valley of the Moselle River, which is a river that crosses between northeast France, today would be northeast France, and West Germany. I'm about to show you a map, so bear with me for just a second. By the year 1000, Jews from the French side of the Moselle, which actually by itself is a tributary of the Rhine River in Germany, are going to follow the Moselle, go towards the Rhine, follow the Rhine, and then settled in what's called the Rhine land. And these first Jewish settlement in northern France and the westernmost of what would be Germany today is what is going to be called by that new name. It is going to be called Ashkenaz. The land of Ashkenaz is those Jews who came to settle these lands. So let me share that with you. Right now, this was the early map. This is the new map. See, it says in the caption here, Ashkenazic rabbinic centers of influence from the 11th to the 13th century. That's going to be really important in just a few minutes when we start talking about the Crusades. So look at the map for a moment. I want to spend just a minute with it. You see the Seine River. It's kind of France, on the left side of France, and if you follow the Seine River to the south, there is a place called Troyes. I know it's written Troyes in English, but it's pronounced Troyes. And that's where a very prominent Jewish teacher lives and raises his vineyard and takes care of his vineyard in those years. He dies 1105, and his name is Rashi. And around Rashi is a major Jewish community created in that place. Now you see the Rhine River. You see the Meuse River, another river that is a tributary ultimately to the Rhine. And you see on the Rhine River, Cologne and Bonn. And then there are three Jewish centers there as well, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. So you need to remember where those are, as they will take center stage in the history of anti-Semitism. So you're looking right there between the Jewish communities in northern France and those along the Rhine River. You are looking, and there's already in Prague and in Nuremberg, you are looking at what is come to be known as Ashkenaz. So if you are an Ashkenazi Jew, this is where you got your name and where your ancestors came from. There was a thing that came around some years ago of when 23andMe came out and people started to do their genetic lineage. There was an article that says every Ashkenazi Jew in America is descendant of Rashi, right? So obviously it becomes clear because everything started in this very small space and grew from there. The only unifying force in Northern Europe, in these places that I just showed you, in these days, as you saw on the other map of the split Western Roman Empire that was completely fragmented. The only unifying force in Europe, in Western Europe at that time, was the Roman Catholic Church. Everything else was fractured feudalism of this king or that duke and whatever their title was. But there was this one constant, and that was the Roman Catholic Church that was headed by the Pope. And this church is going to do its what it can to struggle to unite the Christians wherever they were in those little, in those many different kingdoms. And so what they do in wanting to foster that unity among Christians is that they send out missionaries. And these missionaries spread out across Northern and Central Europe with their mission to convert pagans and stamp out heresies. And the church was organized the ways kingdoms were, really, with the Pope at the top of the pyramid, and then bishops and then abbots who were roughly equals to nobles and knights, really. And in fact, historically, it is known that those nobles and knights or those bishops and abbots came all from the same families, because you find that many bishops owned large estates, had many vassals, and relied on serfs to work their land. So it's not like there was there was no separation of church and state. Bishops themselves were the owners of the land. They were the rulers of the land. And these church leaders took part in the struggles for power that took place in those days, conquering this other person's territory, and so on and so forth. And a few of those bishops, or whatever their title was, went to war themselves. So when the Jews arrived in Northern Europe in the 8th and then the 9th century, it really was a time when the region's economy was barely beginning to recover from those centuries of war and invasion. And because the Christians were concentrating on protecting themselves from these repeating invasions, and because few of them had the skills, the experience, let alone the contacts and connections to revive trade with countries that were far away around the world, around the Mediterranean Sea, they became very interested, those leaders, right, those rulers, either church or secular, they became very interested in the Jews. Why? Because they realized that these Jews who have now been 200 or 300 or 400 years, 200 or 300 years, among them, they themselves are very connected to all of these very far away places. Why? But you remember the first map. Because there were Jewish communities all around the Roman world and even beyond. There were Jewish communities in Babylonia, and you can imagine that from there, and we know that for a fact, there were Jewish communities in India, there were Jewish communities in China, there were Jews who participated in the trade of silk, in the trade of whatever came back and forth from the Middle East to the Far East and on their way back, because they could travel, not because they could travel. Well, two reasons they could travel. First of all, they were citizens of no country, and they were at war with no one. So in those centuries, we'll talk about Islam later, but there was a great divide between Islam and Christianity, and they were at war. So Christians could not travel through Muslim lands. If they wanted to get, silk from China, they had to rely on other people or whatever spices or whatever they needed. And so the only people who could cross over all those vast distances, because, again, they were citizens of none, were the Jews. Secondly, Jews could travel because everywhere they went, there was a community to sleep, to be hosted by. If it were Shabbat, they could have Shabbat with the locals, right? And they knew everyone there. So these Christian leaders in Northern Europe who want to revive the economy of their country are turning to Jews, especially to Jewish merchants, for their connections, for their ability to do business across borders. And because Jews were banned from land ownership under Christendom, these Jews were not tied to the land. I mean, there are obviously exceptions, and depending on who the ruler was at the time, we have Rashi who has land and grow his grapes, and he makes his wine. So it's not uniform, right? And oftentimes historians try to make a uniform statement that Jews were banned from owning land in their Christianity. That was not always the case. There were times and there were places. But overall, the Jews were not tied to the land. They were not. They were also in those centuries not tied to a particular local ruler, right? If you lived in one place and if you had land in one place, you were under the umbrella of the local ruler, and therefore, in fact, you belonged to that ruler as a serf, right? But Jews, in most cases, did not own land, and so they were free to move from place to place, and they were free to move across border and travel. Also, to the Jews' advantage, they were literate. They were learned at the time when the overwhelming majority of Europeans could neither read nor write. That is because Jews were brought up in a context of community that had a Jewish education. By the year 900, the Talmud is codified and written and is spreading around. There is great knowledge that is shared inside Jewish communities. So Jews are knowledgeable, they are learned, they are thoughtful, they reason. And there's a lot of ands there, but there is really a nice list of how the Jews were positioned in that turn of the millennia, right, to be very useful to the Christians. Because, here's probably the last end of the list, because of their travels, because they were allowed to especially travel through Muslim lands, they learned this new, very practical system for counting. You know, that one that came from those Muslims, that was called, and we know it to this day, the decimal system. And so the Jews learned that from the Muslims, and for business and for transacting and for accounting, that was incredible, a technology that the Jews were able to own, really, to take as their own as well. The church made a real mistake. They first of all, they saw this new system as, anything coming from Islam was not to be obviously adopted. It was by the 1400s they actually banned it. The decimal system was seen as a pagan device, and it was banned by the church, who defined its utilization as evil. And what that did is that it caused those Christians who would have wanted to be merchants, really, it was a huge setback for them, because they couldn't speak the language of international trade because of the church. Now, why am I insisting on all of this? Why am I drawing this list of all the great advantages that Jews had in those few short 100 years? Because if you really pay attention to all that I am saying, all of these that right now you believe, wow, that was great, each and every single one of these advantages that the Jews supposedly had through those generations are going to become the fodder for the most anti-Semitic accusations down the road. Jews are greedy. They are money grubbing. They are money grubbing, but understand that the paradox of that, obviously, is that though the church is going to accuse the Jews of those evil, business mentality, the church and the Christians of Europe, asked the Jews to do that for them because they couldn't do it for themselves. So at first it's like, yes, we want you to help us grow the economy, to help us trade, to help us, reach far away places. Oh, and on the backside of that, we're going to accuse you of all the evils of the world because you're doing this for us. Thank you very much, right? And understand as well that all of these seemingly, advantages that Jews had only added to their differentness, right? They were different in the eyes of the Christians. They were bizarre. They were doing different things. They spoke different languages. They were using all of those things that the church said was banned. And that strengthened the sense that these Jews really were outsiders, right? Most of them didn't own land. They were not attached to any ruler. They were traveling. They were probably in cahoots with those Muslims. How else would they be able to travel through their lands, right? They were not part of us. They were not part of us, the good Christians of Europe. Their life was very different. And to add insult to injury, Jewish merchants dealt exclusively with the noble class. Why? Because they were the only ones who could afford all of these imported luxury goods that the Jews brought back. And just that, and we'll see that over and over again, created deep, deep resentment in the masses of Christian people. And that resentment, as you well know, was only fueled by the anti-Jewish Sunday sermons, week in and week out, against these Jews, rejectors and murderers of Christ, every Sunday at their local church and every Christian holiday, and that for centuries upon centuries. And when Jews weren't merchants, not all of them were merchants, as we can imagine. Look at Rashi. They were also allowed to work as shoemakers. They could be in the textile industry as dyers. They could be blacksmiths. They could be butchers. They could make harnesses for horses. They could be scribes. They could be winemakers. They could be physicians, right? They could have all of those professions, actually, which, few people give credit Christianity for allowing that to be the case. But again, it's just fascinating. That also, in turn, aroused strong anti-Jewish feelings in their Christian neighbors who saw them as rivals and competitors. So all of these resentments, all of that hatred, ongoingly stoked by the church's insistence on Jews having rejected the one true religion, having denied God's truth and refused to accept Jesus as the Messiah, could only lead to the belief in the one explanation, that Jews were partners to the devil. Jews must be partners to the devil. And for many Christians, therefore, showing contempt for the Jews, and it's so critical to understand that, showing contempt for the Jews became a way of affirming their own faith. Just like the church from its beginning needed the Jews to stick around so that it could step on their head and prop itself up from their poverty and their being relegated to the dirt of the earth, then the church could show their triumph over them. In the same way, it works at the individual level, right? That Christians in the villages, in the little cities, could be contemptuous of the Jews as a way to affirming their own personal faith. And so as early as the 9th century, we see Christians in a number of French towns that made it a custom of assaulting Jews on Easter, every Easter, after their local church celebration, where, each year the Jews killed Jesus over and over and over again. And so they attacked their Jewish neighbors coming out of the church with this fervor, their pious anger, but never at that time, never to be so violent that they would die, violent and vile enough that the Jews would be humiliated, demeaned, and degraded, but not so much that he would scare them and cause them to leave town, because they still needed them. They still needed them. And so that there was this dance that was played for those hundreds of years in this very kind of sick and twisted relationship between Jews and Christians. Now here is an excerpt of an account written by an anonymous Jew of Speyer. You saw that name on the Rhine River, right? It's a city in the Rhineland. And this took place, just to give you an example, in 1084. And this family, this person writes, "We came to Speyer as a result of the fire that had broken out in the city of Mainz. All the Jews' quarters and their streets were burned, and we stood in great fear of the burghers." So at the time, the local citizens were called burghers, right? So he doesn't say how come the Jewish quarters were burned down, but he kind of hint at it by saying they were in great fear of the locals, of the burghers. At the same time, Meir Cohen came from Worms, bearing an ornate copy of Leviticus. And the burghers thought it was so ornate that it was made of real silver and gold. And so they killed him. Those burghers were the ones, those citizens of those little villages, these towns, were the ones for whom the Jews were the direct rivals. And so life was often precarious, to say the least. And many times over the violence erupted against Jews, the paradox is that the deeply Jewish edicts of the church, till this moment, paradoxically protected Jews from the worst, right? The Jews were protected from the worst, which is, being murdered. But that all changed in November of 1095. That month, hundreds of religious and political leaders gathered to listen to Pope Urban II, calling all Christians to take up arms and return Christian holy places in Jerusalem from the evil Muslim occupiers who had vowed to destroy them back to the church. And doing so, he said, would cleanse anyone of any sin and would guarantee any crusader a place in heaven in case of death. And in the Pope's mind, and we have some of his writing, in the Pope's mind, he believed that if anything, would finally unite the Christians. And the truth is that the Pope's bet paid off, because the response was, let's say, enthusiastic. The response was overwhelming. And all of those armies of all the powerful local rulers, in fact, came together as one army under the leadership of the church, like the Pope's, amazing dream becoming true. By 1099, they conquered Jerusalem and established 4 Christian states in that region. But the destruction they left in their wake, which I'm going to talk about right now, freed a demon that never left us. Now imagine if you will, by the spring of 1096, hundreds of dukes and barons and counts and knights joined the crusade. Their motivation was a great sense of adventure, of course, but also greed. Let's be honest. Because, wherever you go, whatever you conquer, there is a possibility of enriching yourself. And obviously the third is religious fanaticism. And they were not alone. Tens of thousands of ordinary people heeded the Pope's call and joined the march. Charismatic leaders had carried the Pope's message across France, across Germany, England, everywhere. The hordes walked through the land, scavenging for food, raiding farms. How do you survive away from home? Just to feed themselves along the way. But also, as they walked through community after community, on their way to the Promised Land, completely looting entire villages and communities. And so you can imagine that it wasn't long until these communities became the Jewish communities. The Jewish communities of the Christ killers that they had heard about at their local church, because some of them had never met a Jew. Most of them had never met a Jew. And now here they are walking through the Rhine Valley, and these Jews that they've heard so much about for generations, they are right there in front of them. And since they were already looting and pillaging every single village that they came across to feed themselves, to survive on the way, it's not surprising that the Crusaders and all the pilgrims that came with them declared, and here's a straight quote, declared it preposterous to set out on a long journey to kill God's enemies far away, while God's worst enemies, the Jews, are dwelling in ease right here, close at hand. And so in May and June of 1096, these crusaders systematically attacked Jewish communities throughout the Rhineland. In almost every community, they gave Jews a choice: forced conversion or death. Speyer was attacked, then Worms, where the mob killed almost every single Jew in town. Many who survived actually killed themselves and their children rather than allow the Crusaders to do so, or to force them into converting. And that became actually known as Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. Suicide was not part of, and is still not part of, Jewish religious code, but that there was an exception, and the exception began to be made because of what happened this month in these Jewish communities. The Kiddush, dying Al-Kiddush Hashem, means dying for the sanctification of God's name. Now listen to an excerpt of a Christian who chronicled the massacre in Worms. Enemies of the Jews took a trampled corpse of theirs and carried it through the city, saying, "Behold what the Jews have done to our comrade. They took a Gentile and boiled him in water. They then poured the water into our wells in order to kill us." Now it's important that you hear this accusation They took a Gentile, that's the accusation, right? They took a Gentile and boiled him in water, and then they poured the water into our wells in order to kill us. The poisoning of the wells. Just remember that. This is where it starts. And when the Crusaders and the burghers heard this, they cried out, they gathered, and they said, "Behold, the time has come to avenge him who was crucified, who their ancestors slew. Now let not a remnant or a residue escape, even an infant in the cradle." And there they went. Next was Mainz, the largest community in the Rhineland, with, at the time, great rabbinic lore. And there too, the offer was the same as in Worms, death or conversion. And there as well, almost everyone chose death. Some were killed immediately, some tried to flee, but were caught and then executed, killed. Others, including mothers and children, took their own lives. Crusaders went from house to house. They went from courtyard to courtyard, searching and killing every Jew they could find. And we know this because testimonies have been written of those and are still available to read through these days. More than 1,000 Jews were murdered in Mainz alone on that one day. And the Crusaders moved on to the next town, and the next town, all the way down the Rhine Valley on their way to southern Europe. Dozens of testimonies were written from these massacres, both actually from the Crusaders' scribes and from the few Jewish survivors who chronicle what they witnessed. And in fact, their chronicles, not all of them, were canonized into Jewish worship. They are included in synagogue services to this day. They are called piyutim, liturgical poems. And they were composed commemorating and literally some of them taking verbatim some of those chronicles from those time. And it is a way that Jews have kept that memory alive of those who lost their lives. Now in 1097, Henry IV of Germany issued an edict to allow all of the Jews that were forcibly converted to return to Judaism. And he ordered all Jewish property that was taken during and after the attacks returned to their rightful surviving owners. Well, that was a very nice gesture. But no one ever followed through with it. And no one ever was held accountable for anything and any of the murders, any of the massacres. And understand that those were neighbors killing neighbors. You know, your neighbor coming to your home and killing every single family member next door. What Christian learned from that was that there was absolutely no consequences for killing Jews. And in fact, the Pope Urban II, completely remained silent. Completely silent. In fact, the only recorded statement he made about that was condemning Henry IV for allowing those Jews who were converted by force to return to Judaism. That's the only one pronouncement that Pope ever made. Now, when the Crusaders reached the Middle East, you know, the Duke Godfrey of Bouillon, I was born to understand his name as Godfrey de Bouillon, vowed to avenge the blood of Jesus by leaving no member of the Jewish nation alive. So on July 1099, after a week-long siege of Jerusalem, he and his men broke through the walls of the city and killed absolutely everyone they could find. the Crusaders actually herded 6,000 Jews into a huge synagogue and then set fire to the building. And it's not just the Jews, obviously. They murdered 30,000 Muslims who had sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And violence triggered more violence. Because after the First Crusade, more Crusades came. And really the Crusades as a whole will last for about 200 years. In England, the Third Crusade, the one that took place between 1189 and 1192, which is the one that involved King Richard the Lionheart. In England, under the King Richard the Lionheart, Jews were massacred in England. Why wait to get to Europe? In Lynn, in Norwich, in Stamford, and Bury St. Edmunds. While actually the greatest violence against Jews took place in York. When it all ended, the Muslims were still in control of Jerusalem and of the Middle East. But these wars had a profound effect in how Jews, Christians, and Muslims viewed each other. From theological attacks and physical violence from soldiers, burghers, and peasant alike. Years of mourning. Imagine what happened in the aftermath of that. Years of mourning befalling the Jewish towns of the Rhine after the First Crusade, of course. And then really Jews never saw their Christian neighbors the same way again. And each new crusade brought more violence, not only to these communities, but to those in northern France as well. And what shifted is that the attacks were no longer led by the soldiers themselves, but more and more by the locals, by the local neighbors, by groups who saw Jews as competition, as the enemy. And the church rarely stood between the Jews and the mobs. Only a few local priests found the courage to do so. One French abbot wrote to the King of France to plead with him to let the mob rob the Jewish communities. This way he actually wrote to the king. We have the letter. This way the ill-acquired property of one race of infidels would help finance the war against the other race of infidels, against the Muslims. That was his letter to the King of France. Now, by the 12th century, Jews obviously now found themselves increasingly vulnerable. What changed as well is that Christian merchants started to also trade internationally. And so Jews began to find themselves squeezed out of these professions. And as they became squeezed out of these professions, they fell into occupations such as banking, such as money lending, and also currency exchange, which makes sense because they still had all of those connections and they still could provide now the Christian merchants who were growing in numbers with the right currency that they needed. And so by necessity, if you want, the Jews now are being really pushed out of international trade and become bankers, become money lenders, and currency exchangers. Many Jews try to avoid money lending, but increasingly, in the aftermath of the Crusade, it became almost impossible to earn a living any other way, because fewer and fewer occupations were now left open to them. And so the process of turning Jews into moneylenders was gradual. But nearly everywhere, it pushed Jews to the margins of society and led to the stereotype we know well, or increased the stereotype of Jews as greedy and money hungry. And the seed, as we discussed in the previous topic, the seed of which was planted and nurtured by the church of the recounting of Judas' betrayal of Jesus and also the money changers episode on the Temple Mount. And I reconnect with that because the thread continues. I spent a lot of time in the first few sessions making that clear, because here it is again. Here the thread is brought around, and it will obviously over and over again till this day. Now, because usury was a sin, prohibited both under Christian and Jewish law, by the way, Christians saw this new occupation for the Jews as proof that the Jews were unfaithful to the God that they claimed to worship. Right? So they have made it impossible for Jews to hold other jobs. Now they are blaming the Jews for charging interest on loans that again, they needed. It's always the same thing. They needed the Jews, and then they accused them of all the evils that they were for helping them. And on top of that, keep in mind that whoever wants to repay the people they owe money to. So with all of that, life becomes really precarious for the Jews in Europe. And in many communities, they become, in fact, the personal property of their protector. It's a step they have to take, in fact, in order to stay and be allowed to stay and be protected. They demand from the land rulers their protection, in exchange of which they abdicate any kind of right, and they are confined to be the supplier of money to these local rulers. And so, as a Jew who was born and raised in Europe, it's interesting to note that those Jewish lenders, Jewish money, was the money that supported the financing of all of those local lords' wars, but also the building of their magnificent castles, of their palaces. It was Jewish money that financed their cathedrals, their churches, and it was Jewish money that financed their roads and infrastructure. In exchange, they were taxed heavily, and let's say mildly, that they were not much repaid what they owed. And so what the Jews did to survive, actually, because that was not a tenable position, they also were lending money to everyone else. And by everyone else, I mean the Christian merchants, who were, now growing in numbers, the Christian farmers, the Christian artisans, and so on and so forth. It's like the European economy was built on the back of the Jews. And it's, to me, it echoes how America was built on the back of slavery. And there's so many point of contact there. I'm not saying there are equivalencies, but there are points of contact. But when the Jews began to lend money to all the merchants and all the Christian farmers and artisans, they had to do it at very high interest rates to make up for the enormous sums that they were losing to their local rulers, fancies of armies and castles and and buying all the latest and greatest from everywhere else in the world. And so this, in turn, because just to survive, they had to have high interest rates to the rest of the Christian folks. It set up a trap, really, for the Jews that they could no longer escape. And we will see next week, when the trap shuts, the consequences for Jews in Europe. But we're gonna leave it at that for today. See how we could cover 1,000 years in an hour and a half. I don't know if your head is spinning. Mine is. I'm gonna get a little water, actually. But it is truly fascinating, those two shifts in history, with Constantine and the church becoming the state religion, and then the Crusades as the pivotal moment to the violence, the murderous violence against the Jews, which until then, until 1096, the church had protected Jews from, paradoxically, beating them up, pushing them down, but never went as far as asking for their life. And that changes with the Crusades. So I'm going to open the floor for maybe one or two questions. I am never able to look at what you guys put in the chat room, because again, I'm trying to deliver this, so I can't be. It's impossible for me to look at too many things at the same time and stay focused. I want to convey all that information in the short amount of time that I have. So I have not looked at the chat, but if you want just to ask a question, maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions tonight. Again, understand this is being recorded and this is also being broadcast. So I'm not going to name any names so that you can remain anonymous if you want, if you so choose. Just unmute yourself and ask. Okay.
Actually, Rabbi, I have a sort of a somewhat practical question.
Yes.
But if no one else has anything for now, the notion of the sort of protector noble,
Yes.
to which they were loaning money for, battle and construction of all of these castles and et cetera, roads and cathedrals. Those are expensive things.
Yes.
Excuse me, Shane, no.
I want that.
I'll send it in the chat, or I'll ask you later.
Okay.
Rachel, if you put it in the chat, I'm happy to translate for you.
I wanted to say, generally, it was never the nobles who were the protectors. It was the bishop of the area, and he didn't do a very good job usually. But that was considered more a church thing. The nobles were busy trying to figure out how to borrow the money and not pay it back.
Sure.
So,
but because they needed their Jews to lend that money,
right?
In a way, they also protected them. Like they were kind of the untouchables of the of the land. They didn't belong anywhere. They were hated by everybody, but they were needed by everybody. But they were hated by everybody. But right. It's just, that's the trap, right? It's the trap that I was just closing with, where you can't escape. The Jews were put in this corner that is going to be devastating.
Yeah, and there was another trap too at the time, and I don't know if you're going to discuss it later, but that was the disputations.
Yes, of course I'm going to. Of course.
Okay.
Yes.
Then I'll wait till you discuss it.
Yes.
Olivier?
Yes.
Someone did put an interesting question actually in the chat. I've been thinking about it off and on ever since it popped up. I understand we're tracing the rise of Christianity and anti-Semitism, but how does this relate to being an anti-Semite? It's an interesting question.
So what I'm doing right now, what I'm laying is the ground for knowledge. It's going to be critical as we get to today, and therefore how to be an anti-Semite today, because how to be an anti-Semite during the times of the Crusade, that's too late. When we stand as people who will call out anti-Semitism as it appears, it is necessary, because as you will see, what happened under Christianity, what happened at the time of Jesus, what happened through the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, all of those stages is still happening today. And I want to be very clear. And so it's very important for us to be able, when we see it happening, to say, oh, that's from, therefore that's anti-Semitic. Because one of the things that happens is that any anti-Semite worth its salt will deny being anti-Semite. And so it can be very confusing sometimes for us who try to point the anti-Semitism in the moment. And so it is necessary for us to be really grounded in the history of anti-Semitism and how it unfolded and all the twists and turns of that history, because then we are better able to recognize it's the way it expresses today. Because the core, and I will make that argument in 2 months, 2.5 months, 3 months, the core doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
The form is different, but the core is the same. And so this course, the first few weeks of this course, is to help us really get really clear on what that core is, so that we can recognize it still today. There is a reason to the madness, or there's an expression like that.
Method to your madness. Olivier, 2 things. Rachel's question was about where the Jews had money. The money lending was at remnants from the merchant days. And it also looks like Professor has a question. So
yes, I see his hand being raised. I will address that. Yes, I mean, yes. It was, let's say the initial funds were because there were Jewish merchants who, became somewhat wealthy. Let's not, which, made it even more of targets. But yes, so the seed for money lending was from this conversion, if you want, of profession, forced. It's a different kind of conversion, but another forced conversion to a different kind of trade because of the rise in merchants from on the Christian side, and so that was the initial seed for money lending in many cases. It was the same people who used to be merchants who became bankers, money lenders, money exchangers, and so on. Yes. Professor Nopes.
Thank you, Rabbi. I would like to know why Jews as a religion or a belief at that time, I don't know the situation this time, at that time didn't try to win new people, new believers, as did Christians, new Christians, those former Jews who became Christians.
Yes.
And were making new members. We call that in French proselytism.
Yeah.
Why the Jews didn't try to gain people to their belief? I don't know if it's the same today. And what that was one of the factors that made it to shrink.
Right.
And then you have the fact that Constantine, as you said, made it impossible to Jews to make any kind of proselytes, because political power was now crushing them.
That's right. So you exactly answered the question. That exactly is what happened. Judaism was a very attractive, still is, I believe, a very attractive religion. The one thing that kept people away was circumcision, to be honest. But Jews were able to marry. Jews were able to have families. Therefore, they were able to have sex, which, if you were to become a very pious Catholic, that is no longer the case. Jews had very, very festive holidays, great celebrations. They were very learned, very well educated. Judaism was a very attractive religion, which is why you see that every step of the way. I mentioned only two. I mentioned the changing of the Sabbath to Sunday, and I mentioned the changing the calendar change for Easter compared to Passover. Those were done because Judaism was great competition, because many pagans actually converted to Judaism. Despite the circumcision, if you convert after a certain age, you don't have to actually do the full circumcision. You can just do a pinprick and draw a little drop of blood, and that's it. That's enough. So it wasn't that bad after all. And so Christianity saw, in fact, and in reaction, started as they became the state-sponsored religion, began to curtail all of those possibilities. And I just also mentioned the other law, that was that the Jews were prevented from interfering and in the conversion of Jews to Christianity, and the church eventually banned anyone from being able to convert to Judaism altogether. So that's exactly why so many, if you look at the history of all the edicts that the church promulgated in those first few hundred years, it was because they needed to really push away Judaism, split completely with Judaism, because Judaism was such an attractive religion. Because of those hundreds of years of this treatment by the church, and we'll see also the Muslims kind of did the same. We Jews have stopped proselytizing altogether. It's no longer something that we do or encourage. In fact, there's a rabbinic tradition that if someone comes to a rabbi and tells the rabbi, I want to convert to Judaism, the rabbi, according to Jewish law, has to say no 3 times. And so, to tell you, it's an example, but to tell you how Jews no longer seek to proselytize at all. Obviously, for many hundred years, it was a way of keeping the community safe and not be seen as grabbing others from other faiths. But yeah, Judaism is very attractive, and it was very attractive 2,000 years as well. 2,000 years ago as well. Okay, it's getting really late. Please pose all of your questions, which we don't have time to cover in the live sessions. Put them on the Facebook page or email them to me, and we can keep that conversation going throughout the week between sessions. If you are one of our blessed supporters and have made even a small donation, you are automatically added, if you so choose, to the Facebook private page for this course, and so put your questions there, and we'll have a fabulous time.
An email address?
My personal email?
I didn't see any email address in the.
It's very easy. It's rabbi.olivier@betaleph.org. You can, you know what? You can say, just email info@betaleph.org, and our administrator will give you my email. It's okay. Public knowledge. It's not hidden anywhere.
And I can write in French. For me, I can be comfortable.
If you write in French, I'm going to have to answer back in French, so be careful.
Thank you.
I'll definitely forward that one because I won't be able to
You will not understand that one, Kelly.
I see.
We're going to close with Shalom. As I said earlier, we always open and close with those kind of energies. May we continue this journey in peace, through peace, as manifestations of peace. May we learn to be peaceful warriors in the in combating anti-Semitism. And so if you are chanting Shalom with me, take a breath now for Shalom. Thank you, everybody, for your presence. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
Laila Tov.
Bonsoir, Laila Tov.